Robert Hansen was one of the most notorious serial killers in the history of Alaska, not because he appeared dangerous, but because he seemed to represent the opposite. To neighbors and customers, he was a hard-working businessman, a devoted husband, and a respected member of the community. He owned a successful bakery in Anchorage, was known as an experienced outdoorsman, and lived what appeared to be a stable family life. This respectable public image allowed him to avoid suspicion for years while a series of disappearances and murders puzzled investigators across south-central Alaska. Born in Estherville, Iowa, in 1939, Hansen experienced a difficult childhood that later became part of efforts to understand his psychological development, though it should never be viewed as an excuse for his crimes. He reportedly struggled with severe acne that left lasting scars on his face and suffered from a pronounced stutter, making social interactions challenging. According to people who knew him, he was often shy, awkward, and isolated during his school years. He developed an early fascination with hunting, spending long hours outdoors where success depended on patience, planning, and marksmanship. After serving in the military, Hansen married, briefly operated a bakery in Iowa, and encountered legal trouble for burglary before eventually moving to Alaska during the late 1960s. Alaska represented opportunity. Anchorage was expanding rapidly due to economic growth, drawing workers, tourists, and people seeking a fresh start. Hansen opened a bakery that became financially successful, allowing him to establish himself as a reliable local businessman. He also immersed himself in hunting, earning a reputation for his skill in tracking large game through Alaska's vast wilderness. To those around him, he seemed quiet rather than threatening. Friends described him as reserved, while customers knew him simply as the local baker. This contrast between his public identity and his hidden criminal life became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Investigators later concluded that Hansen deliberately targeted women who he believed were less likely to be reported missing immediately or whose disappearances might receive less attention. Many of the victims were involved in sex work or worked as exotic dancers, making them especially vulnerable in an era when crimes against marginalized women often received limited investigative resources. Authorities believe Hansen used careful planning to isolate his victims, taking advantage of Alaska's immense wilderness and his extensive knowledge of remote terrain. His familiarity with aviation, hunting, and isolated locations gave him logistical advantages that complicated investigations. For years, missing person reports seemed disconnected, and without modern DNA databases or sophisticated digital investigative tools, law enforcement struggled to identify patterns that linked the disappearances. The remoteness of Alaska itself became an obstacle, as enormous forests, mountains, and sparsely populated areas created countless places where evidence could remain undiscovered for years. Hansen's ability to maintain an ordinary life while committing repeated violent crimes made the eventual revelation especially shocking to both investigators and the public. The investigation that ultimately exposed Hansen did not begin with a dramatic discovery of physical evidence but with the determination of a survivor. In June 1983, Cindy Paulson escaped after being abducted and managed to reach safety. Despite being frightened and injured, she provided police with a detailed account of her ordeal and identified her attacker. Initially, Her claims faced skepticism because of assumptions made about her background, a problem that has since become an important lesson in victim-centered policing. Fortunately, some investigators continued examining her statements rather than dismissing them. Around the same time, Alaska authorities were already investigating the discovery of unidentified human remains in remote wilderness areas surrounding Anchorage. The similarities among several cases gradually suggested that a single offender might be responsible. Investigators began comparing missing person reports, witness interviews, forensic findings, and timelines. One of the key figures in advancing the investigation was Glenn Flotha, who worked with other officers to connect evidence that had previously seemed unrelated. Their work highlighted the importance of persistence in criminal investigations, especially when victims come from vulnerable populations. As evidence accumulated, attention increasingly focused on Hansen. His background as a hunter, his ownership of a small aircraft, and his familiarity with remote regions aligned with aspects of the developing offender profile. Police eventually obtained warrants to search his home, vehicles, and property. What investigators discovered significantly strengthened their case. They recovered personal items believed to belong to victims, including jewelry that family members later identified. They also found firearms consistent with investigative findings and, perhaps most significantly, an aviation map containing markings that corresponded with locations where victims' remains had been discovered. The map became a powerful piece of circumstantial evidence because it connected Hansen's movements with remote disposal sites spread across the Alaskan wilderness. Faced with mounting evidence, Hansen eventually confessed to multiple murders as part of a plea agreement. He admitted responsibility for killing at least 17 women, although investigators believed the actual number of victims may have been higher. His confession allowed authorities to recover additional remains and provided long-awaited answers to several families who had spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. The investigation became a landmark example of how survivor testimony, patient detective work, forensic evidence, and coordinated law enforcement efforts can combine to solve even highly complex serial homicide cases. The criminal proceedings that followed revealed not only the scale of Hansen's crimes but also the systematic planning behind them. Prosecutors built a case supported by physical evidence, witness testimony, recovered belongings, aviation records, and Hansen's own admissions. Rather than taking the case to a lengthy public trial on every allegation, Hansen entered into a plea agreement in which he confessed to numerous murders in exchange for prosecutors not pursuing certain additional charges. Such agreements can be controversial, but they are sometimes used to secure convictions, obtain reliable confessions, recover victims' remains, and spare survivors and families from lengthy courtroom proceedings. In 1984, Hansen received a sentence totaling 461 years plus life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again be released into society. He spent the rest of his life in prison before dying in 2014 at the age of 75. The investigation prompted broader discussions about how law enforcement agencies respond to missing persons cases, particularly those involving marginalized victims. Many observers argued that earlier disappearances had not received the urgency they deserved because several victims were involved in sex work or lived unstable lives. Since then, policing practices in many jurisdictions have increasingly emphasized that every missing person deserves equal investigative attention regardless of occupation, lifestyle, or social status. The Hansen case also demonstrated the importance of behavioral analysis, geographic profiling, interagency cooperation, and meticulous forensic documentation. Investigators had to piece together evidence collected over many years from widely separated locations, illustrating how serial homicide investigations often require extraordinary patience and coordination. Beyond criminal justice, the case influenced public understanding of how dangerous offenders can successfully hide behind ordinary appearances. Hansen did not fit the popular stereotype of a visibly threatening criminal. He maintained steady employment, supported a family, paid taxes, and interacted with neighbors who had little reason to suspect him. This dual existence challenged assumptions about how violent offenders present themselves in everyday life. Experts continue to study the case not to sensationalize it but to better understand offender behavior, victim selection, investigative challenges, and opportunities for earlier intervention. Modern forensic science, computerized records, and improved communication among agencies have significantly enhanced investigators' ability to identify similar patterns today, although the Hansen investigation remains an important historical example of the limitations that existed during the late 1970s and early 1980s. The legacy of Robert Hansen's crimes continues to shape discussions about criminal investigation, victim advocacy, and public memory in Alaska. The case has been examined in numerous books, documentaries, podcasts, and television programs because it illustrates several recurring themes in criminal justice: the dangers of overlooking vulnerable victims, the importance of believing credible survivor testimony, and the reality that dangerous offenders may blend seamlessly into their communities. Among the best-known dramatizations is the 2013 film The Frozen Ground, which depicts the investigation while taking some dramatic liberties typical of feature films. Although such productions introduce the story to wider audiences, historians and investigators generally encourage viewers to distinguish between dramatized storytelling and documented evidence. The true significance of the Hansen investigation lies not in its notoriety but in the lessons it offers. It reminds investigators to avoid assumptions based on a victim's background, demonstrates the value of persistent detective work even when cases appear disconnected, and highlights the importance of preserving physical evidence that may become meaningful years later. It also underscores the courage required of survivors who come forward despite fear, trauma, or skepticism. For the families of Hansen's victims, the investigation brought a measure of accountability, though no conviction could undo their losses. Today, the case remains one of the darkest chapters in Alaska's criminal history and is frequently studied in criminology courses as an example of serial offending, investigative persistence, and the evolution of forensic techniques. Rather than remembering Hansen for the fear he created, many commentators argue that the enduring focus should be on the victims whose lives were cut short, the survivor whose testimony helped break the case, and the investigators who patiently assembled the evidence needed to stop a killer. Their combined stories transformed what had once seemed like a series of isolated disappearances into one of the most significant criminal investigations ever conducted in Alaska, leaving lasting lessons for law enforcement agencies and communities across the United States.